Good morning, everyone. My name is Jessica Duganzik, and I am the Vice President of Events for the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really looking forward to today's program with Dan Schnur, politics professor at USC, UC-Berkeley, and Pepperdine. If you are just joining us for the first time today, we will be taking your questions in about 25 minutes. You can submit your questions using the control panel on your right-hand side. There is a question section, and we will get to as many of your questions as we possibly can. Without further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker. You guys probably know him well, Dan Schnur. Thank you so much. I'll turn this over to you.
Jessica, thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for being with us here for this week's installment of Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. As you may have seen in the promotional emails that we sent out over the course of the week, there's 3 topics we're going to be talking about today. In just a moment, we'll start by talking about the confirmation hearings for Amy Coney Barrett, and in particular, as I referenced to you last week, we'll be talking in particular about the role of abortion, not just in the confirmation hearings themselves, but in the aftermath of what now looks to be an almost certain confirmation for Judge Barrett. Second, we're going to turn our attention to the campaign trail, and we'll start with a discussion on the debate over debates. And originally there were supposed to be 3 presidential debates, as there have been in every presidential election for several decades. It now looks like we're down to 2. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And then we'll take a look at the polls and some of the key swing voters before we open it up for my favorite part of every program, which is hearing your thoughts. And I'll do my best, as always, to answer your questions. So let's get started. And we'll begin, as I said a minute ago, we'll get started by talking about Amy Coney Barrett and the confirmation hearings that she has been undergoing this week. So on Monday, on the first day of the hearings, both Lindsey Graham, the Republican chair of the Judiciary Committee, and Democrat Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, both said, in slightly different language, both said it would take something extremely unexpected for Barrett not to be confirmed to the Supreme Court. Originally, there was some thought among Democrats that perhaps as many as the 4 needed Republicans to defeat her nomination would stand up against her, given the very late date of the president's nomination of her following the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And once it became clear that Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Senator Susan Collins of Maine would be the only 2 Republicans to oppose her, it's been pretty much a done deal since. There was some question, and I think we referenced it a week or 2 ago, that the Democrats might try to delay the vote, even if they couldn't defeat Barrett. They might try to delay the vote until after the election, in hopes that if there are defeated Republican senators, that in that lame duck period, they might feel less obligated to vote for Barrett's confirmation. Right now, and we won't know for sure, but right now it appears that the Democrats have decided not to try to delay the confirmation. It appears that the Judiciary Committee will vote 1 week from today to move it to the full Senate. And then the following week, either the following Monday or Tuesday, October 26th or 27th, roughly a week before the election, in all likelihood, Judge Barrett will become Justice Barrett. So why didn't the Democrats fight it? Well, one, they might have realized that they, no matter how much they tried to stall, they might not have been able to put it off till post-election. But I think the other thing going on here is that it's because it's so close to the election. Right now, the Democrats simply don't want to do anything that might hurt Joe Biden's chances. They see him with a lead in the polls. They feel things are heading in his direction, and didn't want anything to happen at the hearings that might cause him some kind of additional challenge or problem going forward. That's why the Democrats have spent so much time this week talking about the Affordable Care Act. They know from public opinion polling that Obamacare is now wildly popular after having been very much disliked by voters in its first few years in existence. Right now, it's extremely popular. A very large majority of the American people like it. And because it appears that the Supreme Court will be hearing a case on the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act in the week after the election. That's been their focus. But there's something else going on here too. The most motivating issue for Democratic voters is not healthcare, it's abortion. And in fact, it's the most motivating issue for Republicans as well. And so under more normal circumstances, if these confirmation hearings were taking place at a time more distant from the election itself, the partisan divide in this country over abortion would be dominating these proceedings. But because the confirmation vote will occur in such close proximity to Election Day, neither side wants to take the risk of motivating their opponents by emphasizing an issue that's so contentious and potentially so electrifying. So the Democrats talk about Obamacare, the Republicans talk about religious freedom and about Barrett's personal biography. But even though abortion is a relatively rarely spoken topic in these hearings, it still looms above all of them because even though it hasn't been talked about all that much this week, loyal partisans on both sides understand that in fact the future of Roe versus Wade may be at stake. And so they don't want to do anything, Democrats don't want to do anything to motivate religious conservative voters to turn out in greater numbers than it looks like they're going to right now. Republicans don't want to do anything to motivate very progressive voters, particularly female voters, by talking about the issue so much. So again, it's not being talked about, but it's there, and it's looming over the entire week of hearings. So I want to talk for a few minutes about the abortion issue, and I think it's worth looking at some public opinion polling because depending on where you live in the United States, you may look at the issue from a different perspective. And so I'd like to take a step back and look at national polling from both red and blue states from the entire country on this very divisive issue. So last summer, just this past summer, the Gallup poll, the gold standard of public opinion polling in the country, asked Americans whether they identified as pro-choice or pro-life. And what they found is the nation was split almost precisely down the middle. 48% said pro-choice and 46% said pro-life. That's within the margin of error. Another question that Gallup asked was, do you think that abortion is morally acceptable or morally wrong? 44% of Americans said that abortion was morally acceptable. 47% said it was morally wrong. So once again, a very, very closely divided nation. The responses to both questions well within the margin of error. And so without exaggerating, I think we can say that the country is split almost exactly in half on this critically important issue. But, and here's a really big but, however, the same Gallup poll also showed that almost 1/4 of American voters cast their ballots only based on the candidate's abortion position, single issue voters. So even though most Americans have a strong feeling on the issue, about 1 out of every 4 Americans feel so strongly about it that it's the only issue they'll vote on, and they'll never vote for a candidate who disagrees with them on the question of abortion rights. But here's the difference. Among pro-life voters, roughly 30%, almost a third of voters who are pro-life say that this is a threshold issue, that they would never vote for a candidate who disagreed with them on it. And a significantly smaller 19% of pro-choice voters said that they would not vote for a candidate who opposed them on the issue. So that's a pretty big difference. And because of that disparity, Democrats understand, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, that highlighting Barrett's opposition to abortion isn't a particularly smart strategy in the last few weeks before presidential elections, because those same working class, culturally conservative voters who lean toward the pro-life position, those same voters are highly dissatisfied with Trump's handling of the coronavirus. And over the years, they become very strongly supportive of the Affordable Care Act. So it's no surprise that the Democrats are highlighting those issues instead. Now, this gets pretty complicated for Republicans, too. The reason it's a complicated issue for Republicans, even given the poll data I just shared with you, comes from yet another poll. This one that came out just earlier this week from the Washington Post and ABC. The Post ABC poll didn't ask about pro-choice or pro-life. It didn't ask whether you supported abortion rights or not. What the post-ABC poll asked instead was, do you think that the Supreme Court's Roe versus Wade decision should be upheld or overturned? And even in a country that's almost evenly split on the more basic question of abortion, almost 2/3 of respondents to the post-ABC poll this week believe that the decision should be upheld. Almost 2/3 said Roe v. Wade should be upheld, and only about 1/4 said it should be overturned, which means there's even a lot of pro-life voters out there who might oppose abortion, but don't want the court to do anything to overturn it. And so Republicans don't want to do anything that's going to motivate the Democratic base on this issue either. So a couple more thoughts I'd like to offer on this, but before I do, I want to hear your thoughts. And we're going to start with a couple of basic questions, and then in just a minute, I'm going to ask you something a little bit more complicated. So Claire, maybe we can put the first question up for the group. Very simple one. Do you agree with the conventional wisdom, which I was mentioning earlier? Do you believe that Amy Coney Barrett will be confirmed to the Supreme Court? Yes or no? And I'll be interested in seeing whether there are people in our group who disagree with that prevailing sentiment. And so let's see what we got. 98% believe that she'll be confirmed to the Supreme Court. 2% say no. But obviously the overwhelming majority of you seem to agree with the Senate Democrats that this is going to happen. And so let's get it over with. Let's go on to the second question, though, and we're looking a little bit further into the future. Now, first, I should let you know that most court watchers do not believe that a case that challenges the fundamental principle of Roe versus Wade will come before the court for another 2 or even 3 years. There will obviously be, as there has been in the past years, efforts to restrict its use in more conservative states. But on the basic question, assuming that almost all of you believe that Barrett will be confirmed to the court, if you have a court with 6 judges are appointed by Republican presidents and 3 appointed by Democratic presidents, do you think the court will attempt to overturn Roe versus Wade once the new justice joins their ranks? Yes or no? Let's see what we got, Claire. And interestingly, a smaller margin, 57% do believe that the court will work to overturn Roe versus Wade. 43% don't think so. And that's a really interesting divide, and I'll be interested in whether any of you'd like to offer sentiments on the reasoning for that when we get into questions in just a little bit. But I want to offer you something else, though, because the majority of you, like the majority of the American people and the majority of the United States Senate, does believe that a court with Barrett will overturn Roe versus Wade. But just as most of us believe that Barrett will be confirmed, according to public opinion polls, most of us also believe that Joe Biden will be elected president roughly a week later. So let's suppose, just for the sake of argument, and the election isn't over, 2.5 weeks to go is still a very long time with such a volatile electorate. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Barrett is confirmed and that Biden is elected. Well, in that case, a Democratic Congress would have plenty of time to pass legislation codifying Roe versus Wade for a President Biden to sign. And that would have the potential to occur long before a Roberts-Barrett court, for lack of a better designation, long before the new court would be in a position to overturn it. So this is my third question for you. And Claire, if we can put this up. If Joe Biden is elected president, do you think that he would sign legislation codifying Roe versus Wade into law? And what's interesting about this question, it seems to me, is for years, both pro-choice and pro-life advocates have looked at this as something that's solely the province of the Supreme Court, of the judicial system, not of the legislative branch. But as we'll talk about in just a minute, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So how did our group come out on this one, Claire? Well, look at that. 88% of you believe that Biden or another Democratic president would sign Roe versus Wade pro-choice legislation. Only 12% say no. Well, we asked the question, do you think it would happen? Not whether it should or not. And I realized that is a different question. But one person who thinks that would have been a better way to have handled the issue from the beginning is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, very quickly, what I meant to do a few weeks ago, right after Justice Ginsburg's passing, is I really did mean, even before we got into the intricacies of the nomination and potential confirmation of a replacement, I did intend a few weeks ago to take at least a moment to recognize the tremendous contribution that she'd made to the court and that she'd made to American life, and in particular the advancement of women over the years. And one of the positive things that I took from the hearings this week is how many United States senators of both parties took the time to offer that credit where it was due. My wife Cecile, as many of you know, is a graduate of Yale, and she called me out for not remembering that I intended to offer a tribute to Justice Ginsburg. And if a Yale grad can be that emphatic about a graduate of Harvard Law School getting that credit, you know it's something that everybody can agree on. But let's get back to what Ruth Bader Ginsburg said. Back in the 1990s, Ginsburg gave a famous speech in which she speculated that Roe versus Wade may have been decided prematurely. Now, while Ginsburg was obviously a very strong supporter of that decision, her argument was that the court's action preempted, it short-circuited a legislative and political debate that could have allowed the issue to be resolved by the American people and their elected representatives in a less permanently polarizing manner. That doesn't mean that people who believe strongly on either side of the issue are going to change their positions. But her argument was that because the court stepped in so quickly, we didn't have the benefit of a national debate on that. And that ended up polarizing the issue to a much greater degree than she thought would have been the case otherwise. So from my own standpoint, I think it would be very ironic if the confirmation of Ginsburg's successor could end up precipitating just that type of legislative resolution almost half a century after the court first acted, and decades after Ginsburg suggested that that might have been the better way to make a decision like this one to begin with. So let's go on. Really important issue, of course, and I've spent most of my time today talking about the court and about abortion. But there are a few other things for us to discuss before we open this up to your questions and comments. The next thing I wanted to talk about was the debate over the presidential debates. Now, as I mentioned earlier, and as all of you know, that since 1976, there have been debates in every presidential election. And since the 1980s, when the Commission on Presidential Debates was formed to step in for the League of Women Voters to administer the debates, there have been 3 debates between the presidential candidates. And that was supposed to be the case this year. The first one took place a couple weeks ago, and most of us watched that. The second one was supposed to take place tonight, and the third next week. And last week, after the president had been diagnosed with COVID, when the Presidential Commission on Presidential Debates said that they believed that given health concerns, that the debate ought to take place virtually rather than in person, Trump canceled. He said, well, I'm not going to debate virtually, and he pulled out. Now, look, I worked on campaigns for a lot of years, and I've been watching campaigns for even more years. And one of the absolutely most predictable things about debates at any level, for president, for governor, for mayor, for any office, is when a candidate's ahead, they don't want to debate, or they want to debate as little as possible, because debates are very unpredictable. And if you're ahead, you don't want anything unpredictable to happen. So if I'm running a campaign and I'm ahead, I want to debate at midnight on a Friday night, maybe at halftime of the Super Bowl. I want to do it in a way that I'm at little risk as possible. But if I'm running a campaign that's behind, I want lots of debates. I want as many opportunities as possible to get the voting public to rethink the decision they've made, so I can move from a position of being behind to one of being ahead. I want to debate every day. I want debates breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day till the election, because that's the way I'm going to catch up. And Donald Trump is the first candidate I've ever seen at any level of politics who pulled out of a debate while behind, as opposed to while ahead. And as many of you probably noticed, it took Joe Biden about 5 seconds, maybe less, to say, well, if Trump's out of the debate, I'm not going to debate either. And by the time the president and his advisors realized that they might have done themselves some harm inadvertently and said, no, we do want the debate back, by then both the commission and Biden had said, no, it's too late. And Biden ended up, I think, very fortunately for him, ending up in a position where he didn't have to do 3 debates and may now only have to do 2, but without pulling out himself. One of you asked a really smart question a week or 2 ago. You asked if it would be smart for Biden to pull out of it 1 or more of the debates. And what I said to you all then was, while it would be to Biden's benefit to debate fewer times rather than more, he really couldn't afford the perception of weakness that would almost inevitably arise if he did withdraw. So Biden gets the best of both worlds. He has 1 less debate than he thought he was going to have, and he doesn't have to look like he's afraid of the confrontation. So now we've got 1 more debate instead of 2, but what we have tonight instead of a debate are 2 town hall meetings, one that Biden is doing on one network, one that Trump is doing on the other, at exactly the same time. And this has never happened before in American politics. I'd suggest to you that these town halls, to the extent it's possible, are worth watching, whether flipping back and forth or come on into the news coverage. Obviously can't watch both at the same time. But barring something incredibly unexpected, it's pretty unlikely that there's nothing that's going to happen tonight in either the Biden or the town hall that's going to change the overall makeup of the race. So the last debate is, at least is currently configured, is to take place 1 week from tonight. But let me take a moment and ask you, given how unpredictable this campaign has been, the question I'd like to ask you, and if we can put it up on screen, Claire, is what do you think is going to happen? Will we have 1 more debate as is currently scheduled? Will there be none? Will something come up that will keep next week's debate from happening, whether it's a health reason or a political reason? Or will we have 2? Because the Trump campaign has already indicated they believe, having canceled tonight's debate, that they do want a 3rd one and are agitating for a debate in the week before the election. So what do you think? How many more debates are we going to see before election? Is 0, 1, or 2? Oh, wow, a quarter of you don't think any of them are going to any more are going to happen. That even next week, if it's scheduled, is going to come off. And it would be interesting to know how many of you think that's for political reasons and how many of you think it's for health reasons. 73%, almost 3/4, do think that 1 remaining debate will happen as scheduled, and a few 3% think that Trump might be successful in getting another debate added to the mix. All right. The last thing I want to talk about is just the state of the race as it stands right now. And I've always found, particularly in the home stretch of a presidential campaign, that what's more important in order to get a sense of where the campaign stands is what's less important is what the candidates say, and what's more important is what the candidates do. And yesterday, a day ago, let me tell you what the candidates were doing. Donald Trump was in the state of Iowa, and Trump won Iowa last election in 2016 by 9.5 points. It was considered to be a very safe state for him going into this election. And the fact that he's campaigning yesterday, not in Pennsylvania, not in Ohio, not in Wisconsin, not in Michigan, not in Florida, but in what ought to be a safe state, tells me that here his advisors really do think he's running behind. And the fact that he's in Iowa yesterday and is going to be in the state of Georgia, which he also won by 9 points in 2016 tomorrow, makes them think that they're in trouble and they need to shore up their base before they can contest those swing states. Biden yesterday was in Delaware, in his home state. He was at home doing fundraising. And while he was campaigning, it was in a fairly low profile way. And while fundraising is a necessary part of campaign, the fact that he was out of the public eye less than 3 weeks before the election strikes me as a pretty sure sign that just as the Trump campaign is very aware of how much ground they still have to make up, the Biden campaign understands that they do have a lead, and that their decision on how the candidate should be deployed yesterday is instructive on that. So let's talk for just a minute about the polls, and then we'll wrap up. This morning, the Wall Street Journal poll came out, and it reflects what we're seeing from most national polls at this point. The Journal poll showed an 11-point lead for Biden, and most of the other national polls that have come out in the last several days show either a low double digit or high single digit advantage for Biden. The Journal poll did not poll the key swing states, and we can talk about that more in our question and answer conversational period in just a minute. But there were a couple other things in the Wall Street Journal poll that I wanted to point out to you because they're very notable. One of the most interesting things I saw, and by the way, as I've told you before, the best way to look at these polls is not as in comparison to each other, but rather to track the trending. And the Journal poll just out, as I said, showed Biden with an 11-point lead. When they polled right after the first presidential debate, Biden was 14 points ahead. And when they polled a couple weeks before the debate, Biden was 10 or 11 points ahead then. So what we've learned, given a little bit of leeway for the margin of error, is that Biden's margin has not really changed over the last month or so, and that he did get a bump. He did see a spike after the first debate, but that spike largely has dissipated, and he's back where he was a few weeks ago. But interesting finding in this poll, which I want to share with you before we go on to your questions. The Journal asked their respondents the famous question that Ronald Reagan asked during his campaign for president in 1980. Reagan famously asked the American people, "Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?" And by a very large margin, they decided that they were not. So the Journal asked that question. And this is a really fascinating response. 50% of the American people said they are better off today than they were 4 years ago. Only 34% say that they are worse off. And a 50 to 34 advantage for those who say they're better off under any normal circumstances would be would manifest itself in a very strong show of support for an incumbent who'd been in office for those last 4 years. The fact that 16% more Americans feel they're better off now than they were in 2016, than think that they're worse, and that Trump is still at such a disadvantage in the head-to-head poll, shows that the voters are making their decision based on something other than they normally do. And here's a clue. The Journal, in addition to asking if you personally are better off or worse off than you were 4 years ago, the Journal also asked, do you think the country is better off today or worse off than 4 years ago? 58% of Americans think the country, 58% of the Americans think the country is worse off than 4 years ago. 38% say it's better off. And just to add on to that, 60% of voters say the country's heading in the wrong direction. So what's very interesting and very unique about these Journal poll results is that even while people feel better about their own lot in life, they're worried about the country. And while we're generally not as selfish people, it's not surprising that often for voters, their own self-interest comes first. And that's not the case in this survey. And that is something that's very unique and is worth talking about later today or over the next few weeks, if you like. But plenty of other things to talk about. And so, Jessica, if we can turn this diatribe into a conversation, I'll be eager if you're willing. There you are. If you're willing to come back and go through as many of our viewers' questions as we can cover.
Sounds great. We have a lot of great questions, so I'm hoping we'll get to as many as we can today. The first one, with Judge Barrett's personal beliefs about abortion, how can she or any human being not have those beliefs affect her decision-making on the Supreme Court? Your opinion, please.
Well, Barrett is not unique in this regard. And ironically enough, she and Republican senators cite what is now become known as the Ginsburg Rule. And for better or worse, an opinion worse for judges nominated by both Republican and Democratic presidents, is over the years, justices have become more and more reluctant to offer their personal opinions on almost any issue that might come before the court, arguing that that would prejudice them should they have to vote on that issue if it did come before the Supreme Court in the future. And so whether the issue is abortion, whether the issue is guns, whether the issue is privacy, justices nominated by Donald Trump and Barack Obama, by George W. Bush and Bill Clinton all have been increasingly reluctant or evasive, depending on your point of view, to engage in these discussions. I understand that judges shouldn't prejudice themselves before a case comes before them, but I think it's got, for me at least, and for judges nominated by presidents of both sides, it's gotten a little bit tiresome over the years to see how creatively a nominee can avoid answering questions on almost anything. So while we did learn something about Barrett's broader judicial philosophy, just like we have her predecessors from both Democratic and Republican presidents, it does seem to be an awful waste of time to go through all this process just to have them say, I don't feel like I can answer that question. So like the questioner, I'm not all that wild about the way this process has devolved, but I will point out that it is something that has become a bipartisan challenge. And going forward, it's almost certainly worth a way to figure out how to, without prejudicing a judge's ability to make a decision on a case, to set up a process that allows them to offer us better guidance than they currently do, because we really don't learn nearly as much as we could or should.
Thank you. The Republicans warn of court packing, as if the way they manipulated the Garland hearing isn't a type of the same thing. Shouldn't the Democrats point this out?
Well, the Democrats have pointed this out, and they pointed it out pretty consistently. The reason you haven't heard more about it is because I think the Democrats, whether Biden, whether members of Congress or Senate running for re-election, or Democratic challengers, they realize that an issue like the Affordable Care Act, an issue like healthcare, is more relevant to the average voter on a daily basis. And while they are furious that Republicans refused to hold hearings and hold a vote on Garland 4 years ago, and while they do argue that the Republican decision this year is inconsistent, despite Senator McConnell and others' attempts to draw a distinction between the two, and the Democrats made what appears to be a sound strategic decision that instead of emphasizing process, which many voters are not all that focused on, to instead highlight matters of public policy like healthcare, on which they enjoy a political advantage. So it's not that Democrats don't feel strongly about it; they've just decided that there's other issues that the voters feel more strongly about, and so that's where they're directing their question. That's where they're directing their questioning and their commentary.
Thank you so much. And someone made a comment saying, let's be honest, if they held the presidency and Senate, referring to the Democrats, they would be doing the same thing. Agree?
Well, there's a shoe on the other foot argument to be had on many of these issues. It is worth noting, as we have in the past, that when then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, the Democrat from Nevada, decided to lower the threshold for confirming appellate judges down to a simple majority. Mitch McConnell, who is then the minority leader, said, don't do this, because if you do, someday Republicans are going to regain the majority and we're going to do something back. And so sure enough, Democrats lowered that threshold to confirm appellate judges. And several years later, when Republicans retook the majority, they lowered that threshold in order to confirm Supreme Court justices. One of the reasons that many Democrats are opposed to adding additional justices to the court is for the same reason. And we've talked about this in previous weeks too, because their concern is that even if President Biden, should he be elected in a Democratic Congress, decide to add additional judges, that the next time Republicans have the White House and control on Capitol Hill, that they'll do the same thing. And Biden, as we all know, has been tiptoeing a very difficult line over the last couple of weeks until recently, trying to avoid talking out on the court packing issue. But it is notable that earlier this week, he did finally say that he did not think adding additional justices was a good idea. And given his previous comments on the issue before this election year, I think it's for the reason that the questioner was referencing.
Thank you. Some of these questions might actually want you to put a constitutional law professor hat on, so hopefully you can navigate these.
I'm warned, I'll do my best.
Thank you. Tell us about originalism. Is this a literal reading of the Constitution and does not allow there to be a living Constitution?
Well, that's exactly what it is. And Barrett, in her confirmation hearings, made it clear that she is an originalist and believes that the Constitution should be taken literally and that modern day judges should not be extrapolating from it. Her argument is that, for example, even if the founders did not anticipate the internet, that the same concepts of freedom of speech are just as relevant online as they were in the town square in the 18th century. And so she, like many, not all, but like many conservative judges, believes that rather than trying to extrapolate what the founders would have said today about challenges that they couldn't have anticipated in the 18th century, that in fact it makes more sense to stick to the literal, the actual words on the page. The opponents and the critics of that opinion, and there's an excellent op-ed in today's LA Times that articulates the opposition, say that that's not realistic, that it ignores how much the world has changed over the last 2.5 centuries. It sounds like a very esoteric debate, but when you're dealing with issues that didn't exist in the 1770s and 1780s, it becomes very relevant.
Thank you. A progressive view of the law is denounced by conservatives as judicial activism, but isn't originalism a form of conservative judicial activism?
It depends who you ask. Conservatives, for the reasons that we just talked about, would say no, that it's just the opposite. That if you're sticking to the letter of the law, or in this case, the letter of the Constitution, that's the opposite of activism because you're not imposing your own opinion on the on a newly arisen issue. Those who would disagree with that position, progressive and otherwise, would say, as I think the questioner believes, that of course it's the ultimate in judicial activism because it allows a conservative judge to avoid taking on an issue in a present day context. So Jessica, I'll warn you, we are bumping up against the ceiling of my constitutional law knowledge, and so I'll do my best going forward. But I want to warn all of you that this is not my area of specialty. But I'll do the best I can.
Thanks. I think that was all that we had in there. So hopefully we can, yeah. Would you discuss the individual mandate and why it's disliked?
Boy, so the whole key to the case that the Supreme Court will hear in November about the Affordable Care Act will be based on the question of whether or not the individual mandate in the Affordable Care Act that requires everyone to have health care, whether that's constitutional or not. The argument in favor of the mandate is that if everyone's required to get health care, particularly younger and healthier people, that it spreads out the cost of providing health care for those who are older and or less healthy. The argument against the individual mandate is, as the lawsuit says, simply that it's unconstitutional and that the government does not have the right constitutionally to require you to purchase health care any more than it requires you to purchase an automobile or breakfast cereal or anything else. Obviously, healthcare is a much higher stakes matter than breakfast cereal, but the concept is, the question that underscores the challenge is, does the government have the right to tell you that you need to purchase something whether you want to or not? And what's interesting about this as it relates to Barrett's confirmation is, for a long time, Republicans have made it clear that they believe, not all, but most Republicans have made it clear that they believe that individual mandate is unconstitutional. When the court first heard a case on this some years ago, Justice Roberts cast a deciding vote in favor of the Affordable Care Act, saying that he believed that the tax that would be imposed upon those who didn't willingly purchase health care meant that it wasn't a mandate, but rather it was a tax. When the Republican Congress lowered that tax to zero, Republicans then filed a lawsuit saying, since there's no tax anymore, therefore Roberts' argument lacks grounding. And so where we're left now is on a question of what's called severability. And what Barrett's in the concept of severability asks, if one aspect of a multifaceted law is unconstitutional, does that mean the whole law is invalid? Many of those who challenged the Affordable Care Act and who filed suit against it believe that it is, that if you take out one aspect of the law, the whole thing is invalid. But many conservative judges over the years have made decisions based on severability, saying you can take out one aspect of a law without overturning the rest. Barrett, without indicating how she'd vote on this matter if she's on the court when it comes up next month, did indicate that she does believe in the principle of severability, and implied very heavily that if she were to cast a vote on the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, that even if she believed that the individual mandate was not constitutional, that would not invalidate the rest of the act. But as 98% of you said, my guess is next month we'll find out. We'll find out for sure.
Thank you. Sorry, I just lost my. Would Barrett's opposition to abortion give the Democrats a lift in this election?
It could. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier at the beginning of today's webinar, is while Barrett's opposition to abortion reflects roughly half of the American people's opinion on the issue, concerns over replacing Roe versus Wade, as we saw, skew much, much more heavily against what might end up being her position should she cast a vote on the issue. So Democrats are realizing that this is an issue that can help them with their base, because there are some very, very strong pro-choice advocates, of course, among progressive Democrats. But as I said earlier, they're also very wary. They're also very concerned that if they talk about it too much, that it's going to motivate a conservative base. And one of the political ramifications of Trump's decision to nominate Barrett is it may have the potential to motivate religious conservative voters, Catholics, evangelical, and fundamentalist voters, to turn out in larger numbers than they would otherwise. And so Democrats are concerned that if they talk about abortion too much, they're going to help motivate those religious conservative voters to turn out for Trump. That's why, as deeply as they care about the future of Roe versus Wade, that's why, once again, the Democrats are emphasizing healthcare rather than abortion, for the most part, over the course of the hearing.
Thank you so much. Can the Supreme Court take initiative on issues themselves, for example, Roe versus Wade, or do they have to wait for a case challenging it to make its way to the Supreme Court?
They have to wait for a case to come challenging it before they can act on it. And that's one of the reasons I said earlier that most court observers who are smarter and watch this stuff more closely than I do believe it'll be at least a couple of years before a case comes before the court that would allow them to revisit it at a more fundamental level. That said, the court regularly hears cases that would potentially restrict abortion rights, whether clinics need to have physicians on duty, what kind of access is necessary, and those types of additional restrictions could be implemented on a 6-3 court. But a more fundamental challenge, as I said, is probably still a little bit further away. And if Biden is elected, and if he does bring in a Democratic Senate with him, if they so chose, there'd be more than enough time to pass legislation that would codify Roe versus Wade even before the court could act on it.
Thank you so much. Do you know why the Republican Party is against the Affordable Care Act?
Well, that's a trickier question than it used to be. The Republican Party was against the Affordable Care Act because they felt that it was an infringement upon the rights of people to make their own decisions about what kind of health, about whether or not they purchased health care and what kind. And much of the argument was about the cost of health care under the Affordable Care Act. But what's become interesting is over the last couple of years, as the Affordable Care Act has become more popular with the American people, the Republican opposition to it hasn't disappeared, but it's softened. And one thing that I think is very notable from this week's hearings is how many Republicans on the Senate Judiciary Committee made it very clear they did not think that the court was going to overturn the Affordable Care Act, because many of those Republican senators are running for re-election and they're very aware that their constituents hold it in very high regard. Lindsey Graham, the committee chair from the very conservative state of South Carolina, who's in a difficult reelection campaign of his own, he knows that because South Carolina is so conservative, that Obamacare is still very unpopular there. So at one point during the hearings this week, Graham was talking about all the reasons he disliked Obamacare. And he essentially said, and if any other Republicans on the panel would like to join me in offering criticisms against it, I would welcome that. And no other Republicans did. So they're still against it. They're just not quite as loud about it and as forceful about it as they were when it was much less popular than it was today. But at its core, it's a question of the right of an individual to make his or her own decision about whether or how to acquire health care. And their suspicion and their argument among the Republicans who spent the most time thinking about this, their argument more specifically that the private sector would be a better and a more efficient and more affordable alternative means of providing care than the government. So I don't know many Republicans who are against healthcare. I don't know many Republicans who are against affordable healthcare. The fundamental division on this issue, like so many other, is who's best equipped to provide it. And the Republican opposition would argue that it should be a much more private sector centered system.
Thank you so much. We have a couple people that asked if you can comment on the New York Post story on Hunter Biden's laptop, as well as the Twitter and Facebook responses.
Well, this is a fascinating story, and I don't know how many of you saw it because it didn't receive a great deal of news attention. But the New York Post reported this week that the laptop of Hunter Biden, Vice President Biden's son, had been taken in for repairs some time ago. And the person who was entrusted with the repairs in attempting to repair it found what he believed to be incriminating emails about Vice President Biden having met with a Ukrainian business national at a meeting that had been set up by his son Hunter. And the email was actually from that Ukrainian businessman thanking Hunter for setting up the meeting so that he, the businessman, could meet with then Vice President Biden. The Biden campaign says that they looked at his schedules for that time period and there is no meeting that fits that description. And so there's some debate about the legitimacy of what the article charged. What's most interesting about it, though, and I'm glad the questioner focused on it, is not the article itself, but rather how Twitter and Facebook responded to it. Because Twitter chose not to allow the article at all because they felt it was not credible. Facebook essentially lowered its visibility on their platform in a way that I'm not capable of describing. But both acted in the presumption that the article was not accurate. And many Trump supporters and many people who aren't Trump supporters expressed great concern that these two social media giants made a decision without adequate explanation or without a policy in place that explained why they were making the decision they did. And even Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, said yesterday that he did not believe that his company handled the issue very well and felt that the Twitter users were owed a better explanation about why that article is not shared. So the article itself, whether it's valid or not, is a debatable question. But I think a challenge that we'll be arguing for a much longer period of time is how and when and why social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter make decisions to allow or to disallow that type of information from being disseminated.
Thank you. The Democrats have had majorities in the past. Why didn't they legislate Roe v. Wade then? Do they prefer to have the issue more than the law?
It's a great question. And my guess, and it's just a guess, is that when a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress existed, there were two obstacles to passing Roe versus Wade legislation. One, as I said earlier, the country is really divided on the issue of abortion. And so you're asking at least some Democrats to cast a politically uncomfortable vote that evokes very, very strong feelings on both sides. And so I suspect the feeling was, rather than expose potentially endangered House members and senators from casting a politically difficult vote, better just let the situation stay as is, given that it is the law of the land. The other reason, of course, is worth remembering is even while the threshold for confirming judges has now been lowered from 60 votes to 50, as long as the Senate still has a filibuster, then it's not possible. It wouldn't be possible to pass a Roe v. Wade law, at least not along strict party lines. There was a very small amount of time in the Obama administration when the Democrats did have 60 votes between Democratic members and independent members. And at that point, their overwhelming focus was broader healthcare reform. But I think you can look at both as potential reasons for it. One, it would have required suspending the filibuster at a time when that was widely assumed to be a political impossibility. I think the other reason is because it is the law of the land, why put potentially vulnerable incumbents at risk? But there's a big difference, as all of you know, between passing a law to reinforce what's already on the books and passing a law to replace what's already on the books and protect against it being taken off. So I think the incentive grows much larger as it becomes more likely that the court might act to overturn.
Thank you. I noticed that the polls in some battleground states show that while Biden is ahead, he is ahead by an amount that is less than Hillary was ahead. Does this give you some pause for a prediction that Biden is comfortably ahead?
Well, I would not use the word comfortably ahead for either side in American politics these days. We've talked a lot over the months about why it makes more sense to be cautious about jumping to conclusions about the campaign's outcome before it's over. It is worth noting that in those three upper Midwestern states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, that Trump won 4 years ago, that Biden's lead is larger and by some margin than Clinton's was 4 years ago. Where the race is extremely close is in states like Florida, in states like Arizona, in states like North Carolina that Trump carried 4 years ago. And so in those closely contested states, I think it would be almost impossible to predict an outcome. And while I'm not courageous enough to predict an outcome in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, or Michigan either, Biden's lead in those states does appear to be notably larger than Clinton's was in 2016. It certainly doesn't guarantee victory for Biden with 2.5 weeks to go, but in those key swing states, Biden's lead is outside the margin of error in a way that Clinton's was not in 2016.
Thank you. Will the halt to Senator Harris's campaign impact the election?
For those of you who didn't see the news this morning, the Biden-Harris campaign announced that Kamala Harris, the vice presidential nominee, was going to leave the campaign trail until Monday because two members of her operation, her communications director and I believe a pilot on the campaign plane, had both tested positive for COVID. There's no sign at all that Harris herself has been diagnosed, but out of caution, she is being pulled from the trail and being quarantined for the next 4 days. I don't think that's going to make a tremendous difference. The vice presidential candidates usually don't get a great deal of attention except in the states or media markets in which they're campaigning. And if she engages in remote campaigning and video interviews, which I suspect she will, her presence will be carried into the state she was going to visit either way. Now that of course assumes, and we obviously hope this is the case no matter who we're voting for, that obviously assumes that she, Harris herself, continues to test negative. If she were to get a positive test, it's an entirely different answer and a much greater impact. But let's assume for all sorts of reasons that this is simply a precaution and nothing more, in which case I don't see it making a great deal of difference.
Thank you. Is there anything that is predictive about which town hall grabs more viewers tonight?
Which town hall trumps or Biden's? In the past, generally Trump's television appearances have drawn a larger audience than Biden's. with the notable exception of the Republican and Democratic national conventions. So under most circumstances, you would want to assume that you would naturally assume that Trump does get a larger audience, but it's entirely possible, given the size of the audience we saw for the two conventions, that might not be the case. But what I would say is this: the audience for the two town halls will be much, 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 much smaller than the audience would have been for a debate. And that's a good thing for the candidate who's ahead and a bad thing for the candidate who's behind. Because if Biden does something wrong and Trump does something particularly well, a much, much smaller number of people are going to see it than if they'd been on the stage together. And so, again, while they wouldn't say it out loud, it appears that the Trump campaign really did make a pretty big error by pulling out of what would have been a debate tonight. So, again, I don't know who gets a better audience, but what I am confident in is that even the combined audience of the two won't come anywhere near what the debate would have gotten, which means that next Thursday night's debate almost certainly draws an immense audience. And of course, we'll talk about that in advance next week.
Okay, sorry, thank you. Is there any polling that shows where those who are pro-life stand on the issue of gun control?
What? I have not seen reliable polling on that. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. What I can tell you is that there's a sizable demographic overlap, and so that and a certain geographic overlap as well. So white voters who tend to be more culturally conservative, who live in small towns or in rural areas, tend to lean more on the side of the conservative argument on both of those two issues. But I haven't seen, and we'll look for some, but I haven't seen reliable information that shows that overlap.
Thank you. And it's a question that's coming up a couple of times, so it might be one that we want to talk about in the future. But how are you tracking the early voting that is coming in? How are you keeping track of that, and how does that compare to past years? This is obviously an unprecedented year.
No, the level of early voting around the country is happening at absolutely unprecedented levels. And the people who track these things, who I read, I'm not in a position to track it myself, have noted that while we don't know, of course, how anybody votes, we do know what their party registration is. And we know that many, many more Democrats in the swing states have voted early than Republicans have. And in fact, there's roughly a 2-to-1 margin on the number of registered Democrats who are voting or have told pollsters they intend to vote early, and just on the absolute reverse, by a roughly 2-to-1 margin, Republicans and or Trump supporters who say that they intend to vote on election day. So number one, you have party registration. We know when someone votes, not who they are, but what party they are. We're seeing a heavily Democratic turnout, and we're seeing especially high levels of early voting in precincts and in areas that have historically voted Democrat. It's not surprising given the president's warnings about mail voting, but the Republican National Committee has been attempting to convince their voters to turn out. But as we've talked about in this program before, it does appear that Biden will have a sizable advantage in early and mail voting, and Trump will have a very, very large advantage in terms of election day voting as well. That's why there's such a fight going on about whether and how mail ballots will be counted, and why so many people are making such an effort to make sure that American people understand that if we don't have results on election night, that's not a reason for concern or for panic. That in fact, if the election does take a number of days or even weeks to resolve, that remaining as calm and patient as possible is a much better path to take. But at least early on, Jessica, both in terms of party registration and the geography of where the lines are forming, it appears the Democrats have a very, very sizable advantage in terms of early turnout.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much, Dan. I've enjoyed this. I'm sure our audience has as well. I know we had a lot of questions, but we look forward to seeing you on Tuesday as well with Ron Brownstein. So Kim, if you're here, I'm going to turn this conversation back over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you so much, Dan. You always give us just the right expertise on these very complicated and challenging issues. So thank you so much. And Dan is, in addition to his Thursday Politics in the Time of Coronavirus, is going to be hosting several of our 2020 election series. As Jessica mentioned, we've got Ron Brownstein on October 20th. And then we have a conversation on October 27th with Dr. Barrett from UCLA on how the media will be influencing the election. And then Dan, you're going to be all on your own hosting election day. That I can't wait for that. Well, I think we'll be. How long did you commit to? 5 hours that you're going to be for us?
Wait a minute. I don't remember this conversation. So we should probably talk about it.
I know.
But,
we're just so appreciative.
I'm looking forward to our programming over the next few weeks and then beyond, because even though the election takes place on November 3rd, politics and government and public policy doesn't end. So hopefully those of you who are joining us pre-election will continue coming back on Thursdays once the election's passed.
And for those of you who are enjoying Dan's programs, we have an easy way for you to make some contributions to help us keep these quality programs going. Please text the word Schnur to the number on the screen. Every little bit helps. We can't do this without you. So please help support us to keep this all going. And then go to our website at lawacth.org and register for our upcoming programs. Sign up to become a member if you're not, or renew your membership or make a donation. Everybody, please stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you soon. Dan, thank you again.